Welcome to the BBC's gardening videogram, some practical ideas and hints on growing fresh vegetables. And that's the operative word, fresh vegetables. There's nothing tastes quite as nice as fresh picked vegetables from your own garden. And then you've got the satisfaction of working with the soil, of seeing the crops come to fruition, and then picking them, taking them into the house. And you know they're completely unadulterated, homegrown. And this is the prospect that faces most new garden owners, whether it's an allotment or a vegetable garden behind the house. A bit of weed about, but not a lot to worry about. And they do tell you a story, these weeds. For instance, groundsel. On poor land, that root would have been twice as big. And you've got twice as much work to get it into proper condition. The mayweed. An indication that a little bit of lime might be an advantage if you're growing cabbage to stop them getting club root. But there's one cure for dirty land, and this isn't dirty, it's just about right for digging. The sort of land I like to start with, a good spade. That cures most garden troubles. Get it down out of sight, and then when you come to sow in the spring, you're starting with a clean plot of land, and it saves you a vast amount of work later in the year. You get the weeds down under cover, and you've just got the germinating weed seeds to bother with. Now, if you're going to grow vegetables, make your vegetable garden look as neat from the start as you would your flower garden. A measuring stick. This one's homemade out of a builder's lat in 6 inches and feet. Might as well start straight, even if you don't finish up straight at the far end. And I'm starting 2 feet from the raspberries because I don't want to chop their roots about. And measure again the 2 feet from the raspberry canes. And I would suggest that if you're a beginner with digging, that you use the line every time to measure off your spade grafts. Because though you start straight at this end, there's a very good fighting chance that by the time you get to the other, you won't be. And it wants to look neat all the time. People are going to be watching you because there's other folks with allotments round about. Now, when your soil is in doubtful condition, if you possibly can, if you've got the time, double dig it. That means taking out a full spade graft or spit deep, and then getting into the trench bottom and forking it over, putting compost or manure or what you can get. Any organic matter, it doesn't matter, I don't care what your soil's like. You put organic matter into it, you're going to reap the benefit. It's a reservoir of moisture, it improves the physical condition of your soil, it brings it alive. And the more you put in, the more you're going to take out. But this soil's in such good condition, what I'm going to do is single spit dig it, that's just 10 inches deep. And then just the piece that I'm going to use for the runner beans, I'll work that 2 spade graft deep to give me 20 inches. And then each year I'll move the runner bean plot, so eventually the whole of the allotment is worked 20 inches deep. And your trench, when you start to dig, wants to be a little wider than your spade, about a couple of inches. And before you take any soil out, get the weed off the top. Just skim it back like that. It'll go into the trench bottom. Because this soil that you're taking out of this trench is going to fill the trench that you're left with when you've dug the whole plot. Now, one of the things that I like to avoid is vast amount of soil moving. By the time I've dug this bed here, I'll have moved, well, quite a considerable tonnage of soil. So what I do is to split the average allotment, which is 10 yards across, into 2 5-yard portions. And then instead of having to take this soil that I'm taking out here, right to the far end of the plot, 30 yards away, on a wheelbarrow. All I've got to do is dig it out there and put it there. Now I'm going to dig down that side and back up this side, and I'll finish with a trench exactly the same dimension as this one I opened up. I've saved myself a lot of effort, I've got the bed dug, and it's a clean finish. And don't skimp on the depth of your trench. Very easy to say, take a trench out 10 inches deep, and there's always a stone in the way when you're digging like that. But do make sure it's 10 inches deep by cleaning your bottom out. And that's a full spade graft. So the weed is going to be 10 inches down, and it takes a pretty fierce weed to get up from that depth. But the only thing I know that'll come up from 10 inches down are dockings. And you turn up all sorts of things when you're digging, from broken pots to pests. And you get this even in the best maintained allotments, and I always reckon that the ones that are slow moving, like this chafer grub, are the ones that are going to do the damage. Now they'll feed on your plant roots, they'll sickle your young seedlings off as if they'd been mown with a scythe. And as I said, the spade was the gardener's best friend. The best cure for that boy, chop him in half. He'll do no more eating at all then. And if the spade's the gardener's best friend, then these are the gardener's second best. And if you're a fisherman, well, you've got a bonus as well. But they do a lot of work in the soil, and it's a sign of a healthy, well provided for soil if you've got a lot of worms in it. So instead of chopping him in two, drop him back. Nick the sides out. Take as much as you can comfortably lift. Throw it out of the way. Maintaining all the time the 10 inches deep that you want. And not throwing weeds into the soil that you're going to use to finish the trench up. When you've finished the digging, you'll be tired of it, no matter how enthusiastic you are. And the last thing in the world you want to do is to have to pick weeds out of the soil you're going to use to fill the trench in. They want to be buried where they should be, 10 inches below the ground. Nick the side of each spade hook. Always stand facing your work so you don't get a twist on your body. And to make certain you get the row straight, use the line. And a foot's big enough for anybody to dig in one bite. And better, if you're not used to digging, to take 2 bites at it. Because it's so easy to damage your back. And then the digging's got to wait. Push your line in, up to the other end. And then all the time your digging looks neat and tidy. And when you're finished at the end of the day, you know precisely what you've done. And those weeds want to go upside down in the trench bottom, and then there's no fear that they're going to come up through again before you get the stuff sown. And it's easier, you've got less distance to stoop. If you stand in the trench bottom, you'll not do any harm. And I can never understand people pulling weeds out and putting them on the bonfire. The weeds taking the nutriment out of your plot, and the best way of ensuring that you don't lose anything is to put them back in again. No need, even at this time of the year, to put them onto the compost heap. Let the soil do the composting. If your soil's in good condition, they'll rot down just as well there as they will in the compost heap. Now, if I was digging this piece of land in the winter, I would leave the clods rough so that the frost could work on them and break them down into that lovely tilth. But it's spring, and it's early spring, and I'll be sowing this in a fortnight, so I'm going to knock it down a bit, so there's less work in a fortnight's time. I'm a confirmed muck and magic man. To me, there's no substitute whatsoever for good, honest farmyard manure. Get that into the soil, keep the roots right, and the top will look after itself. But a lot of people can't get farmyard manure. Anything then that'll rot down, any organic matter that'll break down into the soil, into that black material that we call humus, that acts as a reservoir of moisture and fertilizer to the plant roots. So if you can't get farmyard manure, spent hops, lovely thought, cottonseed waste, peat and bone meal mixed, or better still, make your own compost. And a homemade compost heap. It's functional, it's neat, it's unobtrusive. Any reasonably sound pieces of timber will do. Leave air spaces because you must have air for the bacteria to work. If there's no air, you get putrefaction rather than breakdown. And if the material you're using is at all dry, water the heap as you build it. Moisture, air, and warmth. These are the three basic essentials. And in particular, if you're making the heap over winter, cover it, because you don't want all the weather soaking in and saturating it and cooling it down all the time. And this 4'6" box is big enough to keep the average allotment going, provided it's used intelligently. You must keep feeding it. Now, the sort of materials you put in: cabbage leaves, sprout leaves, any straw you can get hold of. I compost leaves separately, though some people put them through the compost heap. Nettle tops, but not the roots. You don't want to put the roots in because frequently, especially if you put them in over winter, it doesn't heat up enough to kill. The idea is to get it heating up fast, so any weed seeds, any pests, any diseases are killed by the composting. Remember that when any organic material is breaking down, you get acids formed that can inhibit the breakdown, that can stop it. So put in about 4-inch layer of vegetable waste, a layer of soil, and then a dusting of lime, and carry on like that until it's built up. Once you've got the box full, by that time, the material at the bottom is ready for use. Look at that. With tobacco the price it is, goodness, you could smoke that almost. And it has that warm, rich, earthy smell that indicates what a valuable material it is. There you're putting back into the soil what you take out. And the soil is not only being maintained in a fertile condition, it's being improved, literally. The magic of compost. Manure is no good in the barrel. The only place it's going to do any good is in there. Now, there's various ways of getting into the soil, putting the manure where it is going to benefit the plants. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, autumn digging's the best. When you've cleared all the summer crops, the bed's empty, it's there to do what you like with, and you can trench it in. Or you can wait until spring, as you have to when you're growing Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts, sprouting broccoli, don't come off the land until the spring. And with your picking activities, the ground's got very compacted, and you've got to loosen it. And the third way is to apply it as a mulch. In other words, when the crops are growing, you can put it down between the rows. Now, you can't over-manure land, you can make it soil sick. By putting fresh manure in the spring, all the bacteria seize on it to break it down into the soil, to incorporate it with the soil. And when that happens, they take all the nitrogen, the plants can't get it, and you get little stunted cabbages and stunted Brussels sprouts. So, beware of what you crop the land with when you've dug it at this time of the year, in the spring. And I'm going to grow courgettes. Look at it, steaming. It's working, you can feel it warm under your hands, and that warmth goes into the soil, and that warmth helps the bacteria to seize on it and pull it down. I can hear them licking their lips, as a matter of fact. And this is what your plot should look like when all the spade work's done. Rough broken down for the spring sowing. When you pick up a handful, it's like silk. And it's got that characteristic earthy smell that shows it's warming up. The bacteria are active, just ready for the seed. There's your canvas, what you're going to do with it. You've got to plan your vegetable crops according to the needs of your family. A few early potatoes, not too many, because you want the room for the main crop, for the winter storage. And then your peas, well, a lot of peas because I like them, and your broad beans. And then your cabbage, because your cabbage are one of the most versatile of vegetables. You can eat them raw, in salads, you can cook them, and if you grow the winter white, you can pull them up in the autumn and store them there, in case the weather gets hard. And then your root crops, things like beetroot, which add variety to your winter diet, and your parsnips, which you leave in the ground so they sweeten with the frost. They're just at full flavour for Christmas. But it all depends how you crop it, on what your family like particularly. And to get the most out of your soil, your crop rotation is, in my opinion, vital. So take a bit of time, planning it out on paper, then go out and do it, and you'll have the satisfaction of seeing your crops growing to fruition and knowing that your work is being properly rewarded. And in the book that accompanies this series, I've illustrated my own vegetable crop rotation that I use on my own plot. And this is a 4-year rotation for the simple reason that I grow potatoes. And the 4-year rotation means that it's going to be 4 seasons before potatoes are grown on the same land again. I'm getting the best possible use out of fertilizer, and I'm lessening the risk of disease, and that's very important. But that isn't all that's in the book, because we're illustrating every crop that we cover in the series, plus a few more that really are necessary if you're going to have a well-stocked vegetable garden. Now, I have a piece of equipment that I made myself, marvellous for drawing drills, because I can get it exactly the depth I want. If I want a 3-inch deep drill, which I do for broad beans, then I can draw it 3 inches deep. And put a line down. I defy anybody, no matter how good his eye is, to draw a straight drill across a plot 10 yards wide. And it pays to buy the best seeds that you can afford. These are green sleeves, and because I'm a newcomer to the area, I asked the people who garden round about which are the best varieties. And you can't do better than that. Try what they've discovered are good quality. Space them out about 6 inches apart. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is as near 6 inches as makes no difference. So you just measure like that down the rows. And if you're doubtful about how good your eye is, then you use a measure stick. Probably quicker, in fact. Because you'll be judged, the quality of your work will be judged by the other people on the other allotments. It's like ploughing, it's criticised by everyone who passes by. If your beans come up spaced exactly 6 inches apart, you're going to have a big reputation to begin with. I follow potatoes with peas and beans because they're heavy feeders. They like a rich soil. And then instead of digging them up when the crop's cleared, you clip the tops off and you leave the bacteria which live on the pea and bean roots and which manufacture nitrogen. You leave them in the soil, and as they rot down, that nitrogen is released. So I follow peas and beans with cabbages, because cabbages are leafy plants, nitrogen makes leaves, so you get bigger cabbages because you grew peas and beans here the year before. And having sown them, this is where the gardener's feet come in. What you want is just to shove the soil back, and even in boots your feet are sensitive. And you're just firming that soil enough round those beans so that each bean is in firm and intimate contact with the soil. In other words, if I don't step back quick enough, those beans are going to come up so fast, I'm going to be like Jack's beanstalk. And no matter how good your memory, label it clearly and accurately so you know exactly where you're finished. I put the date on because the speed at which the seeds come up is a fair indication of the way the soil's warming up in spring. And to make everything neat, rake down the rows. Now, there's a lot of rubbish talked in gardening textbooks about do's and don'ts. They say don't rake over newly sown seeds. Well, I maintain as long as you rake with the row and not across it, and do it circumspectly, then you'll do no harm. And what you're aiming at, you see, if you left it pan down hard with your feet, the rainwater, instead of running in, would just bounce off the top. So what you do is to leave the top loose, tilt up with the rake, so that when it rains, it percolates slowly down to the seed. And it's always warm rain in this spring. There seems to be a magic quality about it that bounces seeds out of the ground. Parsnips are a crop that need to be into the ground early. Draw the drill about an inch deep, put a dusting of lime in and sow the seed thinly. Parsnips, even though they need a long growing season, are very reluctant to germinate. Frequently, before the things are through and you can see the line of the row, the weeds are up before them. So to make certain that I've got a line or an indicator to show where the row is, I sow radish. And not only do I have a marker for my parsnips, I've got the makings of a good salad in the radish. Now, there's some seeds that you just can't sow into the open ground, otherwise they check and they're difficult to carry on, or they don't get a long enough growing season, so you start them off under glass in a potting shed. Now, making up a seed tray is a simple business, I thought anyway, and then I learned a trick this morning that I'd never thought of before. Put a little bit of the compost that we use from the stack outside in the bottom of the tray. And the seedling roots go straight down into that, seeming to know that there's an ever-ready food supply. Now, when you're filling a seed tray, use a standard compost, either John Innes or one of the no-soil composts based on peat. Firm your corners as you go on. The temptation always is to firm the centre, forget about the corners, and then when you're watering, all the water runs straight out down the sides and the middle never gets wet. And then level off. It should look like a billiard table, otherwise you get your seedlings growing in patches over the compost where the seeds roll downhill into the hollows, which is not a good advert for your gardening ability. Now, cauliflower is one of these seeds that I sow in trays because if there's any check to growth, they form what we call a button curd. They don't develop a full big head, they form a little tiny one that's used to neither man nor beast. And cauliflower seed is fairly fine, but it's easy enough to sow. That's one of the beauties. It's round and it rolls off your fingers. Wipe your hands a little bit. And a pinch of seed. Sow the corners first and round the edges. It's like watering. I was always taught when I was watering seed trays, water the edges, lad, and the middle will water itself. And the same thing applies to seed sowing. If you scatter it round the edges, some of the seedlings bounce into the middle, and you get a good even sowing over the whole lot. Sow thinly as you possibly can, because if you get any sort of overcrowding in the seed tray, you're going to be in trouble with disease, and that's a nuisance. Now, that's fine. And depending on the size of the seed, the depth to which you cover them, the seed contains within itself just enough nutriment to get the leaves, the first seed leaves, above the soil. If it can't reach the soil surface before the supply of food's exhausted, then it dies, and you blame the nurseryman for selling you bad seed in the first place. There's very little bad seed. There's an awful lot of bad gardeners, I find. Firm it down, because they generate enormous energy when they're striking into growth, and they can lift right out of the compost and dry off. label it. Now all that needs is a watering and it'll go out into the frame and fine. And I'll be interested to see whether that tip given to me about putting compost in the bottom does produce a better plant. Now that technique works very well for cauliflowers. Onions, leeks, which belong to the same family, of course, I always did put a little bit of something that's going to give them a high nitrogen kick. I've always have, in my own gardening experience, found that if you don't get the compost for leeks and onions rich enough, they flash. And it took me a lot of years to discover why the tips of my plants, of my onions and my leeks, were turning brown or flashing. Swipe off the surplus, and then because both onions and leeks like a really solid seed bed, I extra firm with my box press. Because they are not covered, at least I don't cover them. I never have covered either onions or leeks. And they do lift right up, and they seem to need the firmness of the seed bed to press against for some reason. And I do exactly the same when I'm planting onions out in the open garden. If I've got a light sandy soil, then I firm it really hard, even put a roller on it. Now, onion and leek seed are black. And if you've got a dark compost, it's a good idea to mix a little bit of sealing white with them. And then they stand out and you can space them very easily. Sow them again, lightly over the compost. And because they're going to stand for quite a while in the seed tray, be particularly careful. Take your time about getting the spacing thinly over the whole area. In this case, they've been so niggardly with the seed, it's a case of having to make the seed spin out to cover the whole box, let alone having any surplus. And then don't cover them, just refirm, pressing them into the surface of the compost. And these, in my experience, are one class of seed that are better for a glass and newspaper covering. And the seedlings go into a frame where the glass is much closer to the top of the seed boxes. And I water the base of the frame to create that humid atmosphere that keeps the compost moist. And then they go in like that. I soaked the compost before I made up the seed boxes, but they'll need another drink to ensure that I won't have to take the papers off once they're in position, except to check that the seedlings are through. Moisten it over. And one of the signs of a good compost, of course, is the porosity. In fact, if a compost is properly made, you really can't overwater. And cover them with dark paper. The paper, of course, helps to keep the moisture and temperature even. Now I'll check those in about 5 days' time, just to make sure they're not through, because the paper and the glass must come off as soon as the plant breaks the surface, or they get bleached. Onions are one crop that you can grow continuously on the same plot of earth, at least for a limited number of years, because what you're aiming to do is build up the fertility. And you do that by digging the ground in the autumn, mucking it well. And then in the spring, you break it down, and if your soil's at all puffy, roll it just to firm it, because you want a firm base. And then, as I'm doing, down the line of the row with a push hoe, just loosen it a bit. And then you get the soil into that fine, friable texture, so you can put either your seeds or your sets in, and they get the best possible start. Now, in the main, I grow sets for storing, because the bulb is already established. They are actually tiny bulbs. And you put them in so the top is just showing above soil level. Now, sets are fine. You're going to get a crop there in any but the most unreasonable season. They're grand for cooking, they're grand for stews, but I am addicted to raw onions, and I like something with a little more flavour. So I grow Ailsa Craig or Bedfordshire Champion, and those must be grown from seed, but exactly the same conditions prevail. And that gives me a good line to work to, tight on the soil surface. Now, onion sets, I reckon, want to go in about 6 inches apart. And because I want the measurements to be exact, I don't bother with any fancy hand measurements. I use a measuring stick. Because onions are one crop that you like to show to your friends. You come round and it's really what a gardener's skill is measured by. The quality of his onions, and that's why in local shows they're what we call a 20-point crop. Choose the best, don't use little ones like that. Those will do for the birds. And that's the value of the loose, puffy soil. You can press them in, but if your soil is a little bit heavy, use a trowel. And the sets are buried just deep enough so the nose points above the soil. You can actually see where they are, and then as the bulb swells, they sit right on the soil surface, so they get full benefit from all the sun that's going. You can always tell by the quality of the onions growing on the plot, the quality of the gardener, because they're not one of the easiest. And one of the great temptations with this particular vegetable is to push hoe down between the rows. And what people forget is that those onion roots now will be out on the surface, running out into the row, looking for nutriment and moisture. If you push hoe, you're bound to cut some of them. And even though you only cut 1 or 2, it's going to reduce the size of the bulb that you pick for storage quite considerably. So hand weed down between the rows, and then once the weeds are off the ground, give them a liquid feed about once a fortnight, and you'll get these 1.5 pound onions that are just a decent-sized meal for one man. Peas are greedy feeders, and they'll need clean soil, so ideally they should follow potatoes in the rotation because they've got the meat there from the manure from the potatoes, and the potatoes have killed the weeds out. And you draw the drill about 3 inches deep, the width of a spade, and take care that you get the bottom of the drill even, because you're going to be sowing these peas individually, one at a time with your fingers, and it's much easier onto a level surface. And just because you've got a thumping great packet of peas, it doesn't mean you sow twice as many and get twice the crop. Space them out so that each has got its fair share of room, so it's got its fair share of food and light and air, because that way you keep disease down, you keep weevils at bay for one thing, and I maintain that mildew attacks peas that are grown in poor soil and that are overcrowded. So give them each a fair share of space. And what? Your spade width is about 8 inches. You get 3 rows of peas across the width of your spade, about 2 inches apart, 2 inches deep. And this is an early variety, which I've used for many years, called Early Onward. And it's one of those vegetables that's reliable over the widest range of soils. And then as a main crop, you can use either Onward or my favourite, which is Green Shaft. Instead of just getting 1 pea to a stalk, you get 2 or 3. And you just take a rake and you knock down the ridge of soil, and it gathers the moisture, what you're after, because these are the early sowings. You're putting them in late March, early April. And quite often in springtime like that, you get the drawing east winds. And what you want to do with these early sowings is to capture the April showers. And when it's finished, all neatly tamped down, just looks as if a Caterpillar tractor had run down your garden. There are half a dozen different ways of growing potatoes. Everyone has his own method. But I think most people who grow potatoes would agree that it's good investment to buy Scotch-grown seed, certificated. That way you start disease-free. You're not bringing things like eelworm onto your plot, because once it's in, you can't get rid of it. Now it says on here that these are sized 2.5 to 1 1/4, and it pays to check. Now I didn't. And all I can say is the man who sized these must have had too much to drink at lunchtime, or was using a riddle that had too many holes in it. I like them about the size of a hen's egg, an average-sized hen's egg. If they've got shoots coming from low down, rub them out. Leave those at the top only, because I'm going to be earthing these up to get a bigger weight of crop. Now, the textbooks say 2 by 2. Well, distance depends on the size of your plot. If you've got enough room, yes, 2 by 2. I would say about 18 inches if your soil's in good condition. Use a measure stick, and depending on the technique you like to adopt, I prefer to plant into near fresh manure. I think the extra warmth lifts them out of the ground. But in this case, the land's been manured during the autumn, and all I need to do is to plant the potatoes into it. Now, the soil is a bit compacted, so I'm going to fork these in. But you can plant them with a trowel, or you can plant them under black polythene, and this is the technique that I adopt for the very early varieties. Well, that one, you see, surplus shoots. I want them at the top only. So rub that out. Discard it. You'll not do the potato any harm. That one is far too big. Now, this I can't understand, but there is a method you can get over this by. I'm not all that keen on it, because if you pay for a quality product, you want a quality product as the end result. If there's eyes, growing points at each end, you can cut it in half. This used to be a winter day job when I was serving my apprenticeship, cutting the seed potatoes in half. Now, there's a growing point there, there's a growing point there, so each of those will grow into mature potatoes and give you a creditable crop. But, as I've said, when I pay the price of seed potatoes, I like to get proper seed potatoes. And one of the joys, of course, of growing potatoes like this, at the end of a day's work, you see a very large lump of your plot filled up. And because you do them so well, you know that your soil is going to be that little bit better at the end of the year, and in addition, you're going to get enough potatoes to see you through the winter, because this is a great storing vegetable, and I am peasant enough to feel a great deal happier with a garden full of food that's going to see me through 12 months than I am if I know I've got to buy it from a shop. And that should give me a good, profitable crop of potatoes. As soon as the tops are through, I'll start to earth up, because they're only 4 inches down, remember. So keep them earthed up, leave the ridge sharp, and then you stop this business of greenback, which spoils so many crops of potatoes. Now, about 5 weeks after planting, the potatoes I forked in still aren't up yet. But the leaves of the early variety I planted at the same time are already through. And these are the ones I planted under black polythene. Now, this method has several advantages, of course. You don't have any weeding to do, and you don't have any earthing up to do either. The only difficulty seems to be in laying the polythene out on a windy day in the spring. But here's the great advantage of working on an allotment with other people, because this job's a two-handed one. Unroll him, Albert, and then I'll give you a hand tomorrow with the same trick. I laughed once when I was growing them like this the first year, and my wife had got the trick of just lifting it up and pulling the potatoes out. And she did it one day, and because it's so warm, all the toads in the garden were sitting underneath the black polythene. And she picked a toad out. Doesn't matter that the polythene's almost buried in the soil. As long as it's firmly anchored down, because it's just initially that there's a problem of wind damage. Once the potato grows through it, you can grow strawberries like this, of course, or anything on weedy ground. And the planting technique with the black polythene is simple. Roll it out, make sure it's well anchored down, move your line to keep you straight, and then all you do is make a slit in the polythene. If your soil's in good condition, you can press the potatoes in, cover them up, measure again. But if your soil's a wee bit hard, then just use a trowel, like a soil auger. And the beauty of this is, there's no more trouble. There's no earthing up, no messing about, keeping weeds down, because the polythene does it. It's as simple as that. And then in, 8 to 10 weeks' time, when the tubers are big enough, you roll back the black polythene, you pick out the biggest. You don't have to whip the whole plant out. You can take enough for lunch. And then, having selected as many as you require, roll the black polythene back and allow time for the tiny ones to grow big enough to eat. If most gardeners are like me, they like the salads early in the year. And the way to beat the weather is to grow them under cloches. And I sow the lettuce in a frame and harden it off, and to make sure there's absolutely no check to growth, I mark out the site and put the cloches, over it for 3 or 4 days before I move the lettuce out. And that pre-warms the soil, and there's absolutely no check. The growing conditions are perfect. And no one wants 20 or 30 heads of lettuce all ready at once, so I use plants to make up the first part of the row, and to ensure a continuity, I sow the next part with seed. Now that gives me a 14-day interlude. And there's more to a salad than just lettuce. To add variety and to get it more under the cloches, some salad onions, a few radish, and they will make a beautiful summer salad. The sort of thing that makes your mouth water with a hard-boiled egg. That soil is warm. Those plants won't know that they've been moved. And you don't need much. All you're trying to ensure is a continuity. But the big and most important thing to do when you're sowing a lot of different things, undercloches, mark them as you go on. Don't think, oh, I can remember where that one was. And this is a useful small variety, Tom Thumb. It's good for cloche work, but not so good in the middle of the summer because it tends to scorch a little bit under bright sunshine. Don't tip too many into your hand, or the tendency then is to sow too thick. Just enough to do a 12-foot run. Scatter them thinly. Just enough to keep a continuity. Do that at fortnightly intervals through the summer. The next, some cherry bell radish. I have a partiality for radish. They give a piquancy to salad. 10 feet will be ample. Sufficient to cause indigestion anyway. And cherry bell is a very fine flavoured radish. Not too sharp. Kiddies love it. And these are bigger seed. They give you more to go at. And then next on the list, some salad onions, because no salad is complete without onions. And onion seeds are small and black. So you've got to be very careful to get them in thinly. And all you've got to do, shuffle a row in. The April showers are what bring the seeds up, of course. They may be cold on occasions, but it's what encourages germination. I move the line over about 7 inches, and that gives you a guideline when you're putting the cloches down. Now, cloches are just 2 sheets of glass held together by wire, and it's quite easy to make them at home. But to avoid turning them into a wind tunnel, you block the end up once they're in position. And then the plants are as snug in there as they would be in a greenhouse. And the strange thing is, no matter how hard the wind blows, they don't blow over. I've had cloches down when the whole of the garden was being wrecked by a gale force wind, and because there's nothing for the wind to get hold of, they stay there. And the rainwater runs down the side, and the water penetrates through and reaches the roots of the plant. It's extraordinary how water moves in the soil. I used to think I'd have to lift them off and water them, but you don't. The plants get all they need. And some of the things I sowed in the end of February, beginning of March, are ready for pricking out now. They're getting crowded in the trays, and they need moving on into fresh compost. And to make certain that the root disturbance, when the time comes for them to go out into the garden, is minimal, I use peat pots and fill a seed tray with them like that, so they're easy to handle. Let them grow on in there until the roots appear through the sides of the pot. Keep them moist all the time. They go out into the garden, then the roots take hold straight away, and you've got the additional moisture reserve of the peat holding the roots as it breaks down. A scattering of soil over the tray, just enough to get them started. And then you get the moment of truth about the compost in the bottom of the tray at this particular stage, and I'm just as interested as the man who told me about it. And those roots are magnificent. That plant won't even know it's left home, let alone it's moved from one tray to another. The roots are bigger than the tops, which is a sign that they've been grown properly. When you force a plant in too high a temperature, quite frequently you get a little top and a little root as well. or a very big top in some cases if the temperature is extremely high, and not enough root to support them. I'm not going to do the whole tray of sprouts because these are the early varieties, and I grow 3 different sorts, early, mid-season and late, so I only want about a dozen of each. That's enough to keep my family of 4 going. So I'm going to do half a tray of Brussels sprouts and half a tray of lettuce to keep the continuity going. And lettuce have a very high moisture demand. They need, well, watering every day in dry weather because the quicker they grow, the tenderer the heads are. And they want to go quickly into the close confines of the frame because there's a cold wind that seems to suck the life out of so many seedlings in the early spring. And a thorough watering is absolutely essential. Really soak them and soak the soil in the frame so you create the humid atmosphere that these things positively demand. And once that's soaked in, the glass on again. And they'll take hold very quickly and grow away there until they're ready to go out into the open garden. Runner beans are one of the really useful vegetables because they crop over such a long period. And the only problem, as far as most gardens are concerned, is where to site them. Well, this is the north end of the plot, the end where the wind comes from. And strangely enough, though they're a fairly tender crop, in other words, they mustn't be frosted, they do make a good wind protector. Now, canes are so expensive, and bean rods, the old poles that we used to grow them on, impossible to get now, that I find the plastic netting is probably the best buy. And provided you get it firm and taut, because remember, when the canopy of foliage is on, you're going to get a tremendous pressure on it whenever the wind blows. Put them in about a foot apart, and about 1.5 inches deep, and space them neatly too. Don't just slam them in as the spirit moves them or as the space is available. Space them out, get them exactly a foot so your vegetable garden looks neat from the minute you start. Now those will germinate very quickly. And then they come onto the canes, they go up the canes, and as soon as the first flowers start to show, spray them over. Because one of the strange things about runner beans, if there's any sort of dryness in the atmosphere, the petals drop, the flowers drop, and you don't get beans. So in the evening, in the cool of the evening, when the plants are in bloom, just damp them over with a fine rose. You'll get a good set of fruit. Then when you've had about 4 or 5 boilings off them, start feeding them. Just a light side dressing to push them along. And you'll be giving runner beans away until your neighbours are sick of them and you're sick of them. But as they're a very delectable vegetable, they're worth taking a lot of trouble with. And if you want to beat the weather and get really early crops, use cloches to protect the plants. By keeping them warm, you'll be picking runner beans before unprotected plants are in flower.